Steve, we know there's another story, a fantastic story, which, since I know you personally, I know all these stories from you, but I think it's important for the chizik of the audience that they should hear this story as well. And this is a story about your mother during World War II.
My mother and my grandmother.
And your grandmother. So let's hear that story.
And my generation.
Before you bring that out, I'm going to say, again, this is a story about the power of tefillah. What happens with the power of tefillah? And of course, everyone knows you daven and people get healed, and you make a Misha Berach and people get healed, and we almost accept this as normal. But this is a story of tefillah being so powerful that perhaps it changed the course of history. And we're going to hear this story right now from Steve. Let me introduce you again.
It's good for me to say it, for me, this story, because I'm just a human being, and I also have, wonder, when I daven, is it having any effect? When I learn, has it have any effect? This is a great story to know not only what happens if you daven the right way, but if you believe in what you're saying, and if you have a proper emunah, what the effect can be. My mother's family comes from Berlin. For many hundreds of years they were in Berlin. Well, in Germany in any event. Most people can say that they had Hitler for 6 years, or for 1 year, or for 4 years, or whatever it was. My family had Hitler from day one to the last day. They had Hitler from the 20s already, they knew him. So the story takes place in 1942, I believe it was. My mother and my grandmother are at that point in hiding. My grandfather had been taken to concentration camp on Rosh Hashanah, 1939, as World War II was breaking out. The custom among German Jews, at least in Berlin, was to spend all of Rosh Hashanah in shul, davening and learning, day and night. They would have their meals there as well. And the Gestapo knew about this, and they came in early in the first day of Rosh Hashanah, 1939, and they arrested everyone that was there. It was a packed shul, including my grandfather. And within a year, my mother and my grandmother knew that they couldn't live in the open anymore. More and more people were being taken every day, and the window of opportunity was closed to leave the country. Not that you could go anywhere, but you had to disappear. So they disappeared. They went into hiding with some friends. The problem was they didn't exist. According to the government, they didn't exist. If you wanted to eat, you had ration cards. So you took your ration cards and you went to a government office and you got eggs or milk or coffee or whatever it was. But if you don't exist, you don't get ration cards. Unless you got them in the black market, but you have a high chance you have to have money, you have to have income, neither of which they had. And who's to say it's not a Gestapo agent? And there were Gestapo agents all around. Not only that, but the Gestapo at that time had come up with a unique way of catching Jews. And that was, they would find, now who knows a Jew better than another Jew? So they hired a Jew who said, we're going to let you live. But you have to give us one Jew every month in order to live. You give us one Jew, you live 1 month. You don't give us a Jew, you don't live the next month. So that's how some people survive just by doing that. There was a big parade one day, and they didn't have any food. They were living on infant rations, newborn infant rations. It was basically mother's milk in powder form. But you don't get enough nutrition from that, and you can't live on that forever. So my grandmother said to my mother looks very German. She has very blonde hair, very blue eyes, and she talks in a certain way that you have no doubt that she was raised to be a good Nazi. And she knows how to do that to this day. And it's fun to watch her do it, actually, from time to time. It scares you, but it's fun to watch if you've never experienced it before. So she went out, and as she's walking through the street, a big open car goes by, and who's in it? But the man who was supposed to be, if anything had happened to Hitler, he was supposed to take over. It wasn't Goering, it wasn't Goebbels, it wasn't Himmler. it was someone known as the Beast of Berlin, and his name was Reinhard Heydrich.
Was actually considered Hitler's closest friend,
right, and
confidant.
He was a master butcher. He enjoyed killing. He came up with new techniques of killing, and he was actually one of the architects of the gas chambers. So his whole focus was on killing Jews. Now, at that time, starting in 1938, the SS had a program. As you know, the Nazis wanted to come up with a master race and a perfect race. So how do you do that? You take people. Now, in Germany, everything you ever did, there's a record of, even if you were Jewish. So when my mother went to school, when you went to school in Germany, Jews too, you had to make 3 copies of your homework. And there weren't any printers in those days. You had to make 3 separate copies by hand of your homework. One went to the government, that the government kept on your file. One the school had to keep forever, and one you had to keep as a record that you had gone to that school. So everything is documented. So they knew not only everything you did, but they knew who you came from, where you lived, everything. And that's how I was able to see who was a real German, who was a real Aryan, and who wasn't. And so they decided, you know what they're going to do? They're going to take
Aryan was actually a made-up thing. There was no such a thing as a real Aryan. It was their ideal person they called an Aryan. Right. Generally speaking, blonde hair, blue eyes.
About 6 feet if it was a man.
Right.
About 5'9", 5'10" if it was a woman. A
right.
certain physical type, an exact type of nose, ear, cheek, chin, forehead,
right,
nape of the neck. Everything was exact.
They used to have pictures of noses.
They
identified the Jewish nose and Aryan nose.
And black nose and Latino, every kind of nose. Medical textbooks had this. So students could study what an Aryan is supposed to look like. So no one could hide from them. So what they decided to do was produce a master race. Get together men and women who had perfect bloodlines, get them together, have them mate, have them produce children, and these children will become the master race.
Same like you run animals. You have an English foxhound, you got a beagle, you got terriers.
And eventually, 10,000 children were born through this system. 10 or 13,000, I forget, were born through this system. They would take a girl about 14 or 15 years old, and it was considered a great honor because you're producing perfect children for the Führer. It's a very high honor.
You were producing the master race.
You were producing the master race.
They called themselves the master race.
And they were going to control the world. They were going to be the new heads of the world.
Right.
You're producing the future leaders, the future controllers of the human race. So it was very special. If you were chosen, it was very special. They started at 14 or 15. They would bring in an SS officer, always an officer, nothing lower rank than a second lieutenant. He had to be perfect blonde hair, perfect blue eyes. Everything had to be perfect. And the women too. And there were different, I think it was 3 different castles that they used for this. So when the child was raised, who's the mother? Well, the mother's the mother. Who's the father? Hitler's the father. Perfect.
Right. One of the reasons why it was called the fatherland. Hitler was considered, Yimach Shemai, Hitler was considered the father of every single every single German child. And everything you did when you were brought up in school was for our father, Hitler, Yimach Shemai.
Right.
People do not understand the mindset that was going on.
You don't understand well, you live in a democracy, so you don't understand a lot of things. But they made of him a deity, literally a deity.
They worshipped him.
They absolutely worshipped him. And when you go out and you buy products now, the commercials you think are made for Madison Avenue, but the person who actually created this whole thing of marketing and how to manipulate a person's way of purchasing and thinking everything, that was Goebbels. That was the one who started this whole thing. In any event, so who does this...
Goebbels was also Yimach Shemai. He was the minister of propaganda.
Right. And
he understood, and people should pay attention because it's being used again today in politics. that it was called the big lie technique. And the way you got yourself believed in the big lie technique, this was a very important principle, was that you got a whole bunch of people to say the same lie. That was the first, and state it as fact. And then the second important thing was, never lie about a small thing. Lie about something so outrageous that, let's say, for instance, the equivalent would be that if the President of the United States right now lies to us, and he says something so outrageous, like, for instance, it's being done right now, that the economy is picking up, when everybody could see that the economy is not picking up, that he says, things are bad, but it would have been much worse without me, when it's not really true, and he's the one who actually is stopping progress. But it's so outrageous, and it's not within your understanding that a president or that a chancellor, Yamach Shemai, should be able to lie to you. So it's so outrageous, and you're so conditioned to believe such high officials like presidents and senators, so that when they do that to you, your automatic sense is that the politician is telling you the truth, and therefore you believe it. Very important lesson, because today, once again, you got to learn that what you are told publicly is not necessarily the truth. So let's go back to over here with Heinrich.
So who did Reinhard Heydrich see in the street that he decided was a perfect candidate for these program?
His breeding program.
My mother.
Right.
Which,
you have to understand that she looked like a perfect German.
Right, but that's not it. You have to know her personally. The idea that she would do something like this to her, to this day, she would, just the idea of it.
Well, it was the most horrible thing that could happen.
Obviously, but not only that.
They looked at the physical, and physically she was
the
ideal German specimen.
You don't say no to Reinhard Heydrich. Not only is he giving you a big honor, but you're making a fool out of him. That's a death sentence. So he said, well, he's leaving the country for a few days, and in 3 days he wants you, my mother, in his office. My mother goes home.
This is the worst possible thing
that
could happen to a frum Jewish girl. Cannot imagine.
Let's say the best thing happens and they accept her. That's the truth is, she has to come up with ID papers. Jews in 1942 had ceased to exist in Berlin. They had a huge festival about a month before, celebrating that after 1,000 years of continuous existence, there wasn't a single Jew left in Berlin. So now you're going to tell me not only is there a Jew in Berlin, but she's been picked for this program? Well, what a disgrace that would have been. So it was a death sentence. Either way, it was a death sentence.
Right.
My mother's a young girl of 14, 15. She can't believe
at that time.
At that time, obviously. So she can't believe what just happened to her. She goes to my grandmother. My grandmother was a rock. Softest woman you ever met in your life. But when it comes to things like Amunah and Bitachon, no one compares to her. So she said, you're not going anywhere. We're going to fast. And we're going to daven. And she fasted and she davened for 3 days. Do you know what happened on the third day? Do you know where Reinhard Heydrich went? Do you know?
He took a trip. I do know more or less. I don't remember the country that he went to.
He went to Prague, Czechoslovakia.
Prague, Czechoslovakia, yes.
And Czech
this
patriots,
is a famous moment in history,
right,
what you're describing now.
And Czech patriots came and they shot him.
While he was driving
While he was driving, again, in an open...
He was driving in an open car, right, with the roof down.
Right. And they got the guys, unfortunately, who shot. They destroyed the village.
He lived for a few hours, by the way.
Did he?
Then he died. I do know the history. He actually lived for a few hours, but that was it. There was nothing they could do to save him. He did die. Yeah.
They took a village. They took all the men and women, or most of the men and women, they sent them to Auschwitz. The children were used as slaves. And the village itself was razed to the ground, of several hundred people. It was a small town of several hundred people. And that was the end of the village. But if Heydrich had lived I can't imagine what the world will look like today.
He was the person who was supposed to take
over after Hitler.
For Hitler, Yamach Shemai.
Right. Now, when Hitler committed suicide, the one who took over him was someone named Admiral Dönitz, who was the head of the submarine service. See, he wasn't a Nazi. He was a career Navy man. He wasn't politically a Nazi. He was following orders. But Heydrich was
the Shem Shemayim, so to speak,
as wicked as a person gets in this world. He would have been next in line. He would have been Hitler too.
But I think it's important to emphasize this, that your mother and your grandmother were fasting for 3 days straight before this happened. And they were fasting, not just they were fasting, they were saying Tehillim all day. It's extremely important that the audience understands this. They were asking Hashem for a way out. Your grandmother was asking that her daughter should, God forbid, never be used for such a purpose.
And you should forget about it, who knows, anything, but not for this. It's the last thing that you want.
Right. I mean, they would have preferred actually to die than to be used for such a purpose. And they were begging Hashem for 3 days straight.
Right. Non-stop.
Non-stop. And fasting.
And fasting.
They made their own tinus. They had nobody to advise them.
There was nobody.
Right. So, and their answer that they got from Hashem
was a Heydrich gets shot and killed, which is amazing.
Well, not only did they get the answer, but it was so public, it was in all the news.
Right.
It was impossible not to hear the answer to the tefillas.
Now, I wonder why, I'm not sure the connection exactly, but for some reason my mother and my grandmother never publicized this. They took this as something very natural. As a natural occurrence. Of course, we fasted, we dived, and then we got answered. What's the problem?
They had a tremendous emunah.
To this day.
Obviously what it is. To this day, I know your mother says Tehillim. I don't know if she still says it
today. She can't do it anymore, but
she used to say it every day.
Several decades, she would say, not just say Tehillim, she would say the entire Sefer Tehillim before Shachris, before breakfast, before everything, and then start a day. And it took her between 3 and 4 hours every morning to say the whole Sefer Tehillim. I'll tell you one other story quickly. A couple of years later, when the Americans and the British were bombing every day and every night, they were bombing in 1944 with 500-pound bombs. So imagine the equivalent of the planes that went into the World Trade Center, but hundreds, maybe thousands of them were being dropped over your head. My mother saw buildings just come apart completely. She saw people melt. So you had to get into a bomb shelter. But in order to get into a bomb shelter, you had to have ID. And you had to belong to the Nazi party. Well, apparently the Nazis didn't accept Jews into their party. So you couldn't get ID in order to get into the bunker. So my mother and my grandmother, they sent people who didn't have any papers.
You're being sarcastic when you say apparently the Nazis didn't. They had a special party where they sent Jews to, but it was a one-way party.
So in any event, so they people who forgot it in their home, which is a bad mistake. You don't forget your papers. In a place like Germany, you don't forget your papers ever. So they sent them to a building it was a wood building to begin with. There was no way it was going to withstand any kind of bombardment. But there was no place else to be inside. Literally no place else. So my mother said, this is it. I mean, we're finished. She started, saying Shema Avidi, whatever it was. And my grandmother said, what? Where's your emunah? Where's your bitachon? What are you giving up for? Just then, as she's saying this, 2 500-pound bombs came together, hit each other, and made a huge explosion, shattering the windows in front of where they were. And my mother got a splinter in her pinky that stuck out there, able to put out after a minute or so. And my grandmother said to my mother something, which to them was very natural, but to me I laugh about it to this day. Because you see what happens when you don't have a moon in Hashem? Mm-hmm. This is what happens.
You were just missing a little bit, so you got your little splinter.
Right. So what happened was, they walked out, and these huge bunkers with 4 feet of cement and concrete and steel, they were dead to the person that had been killed. My mother, my grandmother, who was in this small wood nothing, they survived. My mother did get a splinter, of course, but hundreds of people have been killed by my mother got a splinter.
A splinter is a small price to pay.
It's a small price to pay,
That's for your life.
But it's an amazing story. And to them, they have stories like this, like it's the most natural thing. You dive into Hashem, and Hashem answers you. That's it. You have bitachon, and you get answered. What's the problem?
Well, this is a very important principle in Yiddishkeit. There is a very important principle that if you do not have emunah, if you go to, for instance, a rebbe, or you go to a rabbi, and you don't really believe the rabbi can help you with a bracha or something like that. In other words, you cannot be makabel the bracha. You're not makabel. I don't believe it. Well, if you don't believe it, it's not going to work for you, because part of a bracha is your emunah, that you have to understand that a bracha is going to work, and this principle is very, very, very important. I do know some very big rebbes and very big mekabalim who are world renowned, and I know that people come to them, and I'm close to them, and I speak to them, and sometimes I'll talk to a person, and the person will say, "Nah, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be." When that person says that, after they walk out, the Rav will tell me, "Well, you know what? For them, they just ruined it because they were not makabel the bracha." It's very, very important to be makabel the bracha and to believe. Part of it, taking a bracha is to believe it with emunah pshuta that it's going to happen.